I can't do this anymore. I never signed up to be your caretaker.
Say the actual word, Dominic. Say what you mean.
You're a liability now. To me, to everything I'm building.
Celine Marchetti had learned, in the 11 months since the accident, that silence could be a weapon just as easily as it could be a wound. She sat in the study of the house on Bellwood Lane, the house her husband had renamed Our Legacy in every toast he ever gave, and she listened to him pack. Not clothes. Not yet. He was packing words, rehearsing them the way he rehearsed every pitch before a boardroom, testing which sentence would land softest and still let him walk away clean. She could hear it in the pauses. Dominic Reyes did nothing without staging it first, and 11 years of marriage had taught her to read the staging the way she used to read blueprints, searching for the beam that was quietly failing while the rest of the structure still looked fine to everyone standing outside it. He came into the study without knocking, a folder under his arm, his wedding ring already missing from his hand though the divorce hadn't been filed. That detail told her more than anything he was about to say. He sat across from her, not beside her, the way a man sits across from someone he has already decided is a stranger. I think we both know this isn't working, he said. The accident changed things. I'm not the villain for admitting that. Celine watched him the way she used to watch a proposal before she signed off on it, searching for the clause buried where no one would think to look. Say the actual word, Dominic, she said quietly. You've been circling it for 10 minutes, and I'd rather you land it. He exhaled, and the word came anyway, small and ugly in his mouth. Liability. You've become a liability to everything I'm trying to build. The rain outside kept its own rhythm, indifferent to the 11 years it had just heard him fold into a single sentence and set down on a coffee table between them like a bill he expected her to pay. To understand how a man arrives at a sentence like that, you have to go back 13 years to a rented office above a dry cleaner in the Ivy District, where a 28-year-old Celine Marchetti was building an architecture practice out of borrowed furniture and a reputation she had not yet earned. She had grown up watching her father, a quiet structural engineer named Adrian Marchetti, walk job sites with a level and a notebook, teaching her before she was 10 that a building's honesty was in what held it up, not what decorated it. She carried that lesson into every design she drafted, and by 28 she had a small but devoted client list, a firm with her name on the door, and no patience left for architects who cared more about how a building photographed than how it stood. It was in that office, interviewing junior designers for a contract role, that she first met a 25-year-old Dominic Reyes, 3 years out of school, talented, underpaid at his current firm, and hungry in a way she recognized because she had once been hungry too. Dominic did not walk into that interview with confidence. He walked in with a portfolio held together by binder clips and an apology already forming on his face for the state of it, and Celine remembered thinking that the sketches inside it were better than the packaging around them, that here was someone who had never been taught his own worth by anyone who mattered. She hired him for the contract role within the week. Within a year, she had made him a partner on 2 major projects. Within 3 years, she had co-signed the lease on the Ivy District warehouse that would eventually become Reyes and Marchetti Architecture, using capital from a trust her father had left her, capital she structured through a private holding entity called Bellwood Assets Group, so that the firm's growth would never be entangled with whatever else her life might become. She told herself at the time that she was being careful. She did not yet know she was being prophetic. They married 4 years after that first interview, in a small ceremony at her father's old lake house, 18 months before he passed. Adrian Marchetti pulled his daughter aside the week before the wedding, his reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, a stack of documents between them on the same kitchen table where he'd once taught her to read a floor plan. You don't have to sign away everything you built just because you love someone, he told her. Especially not for love. Love should never require you to disappear. She had signed plenty that week, the marriage license, the seating charts, the caterer's contract, but she had never signed away Bellwood Assets Group, never coming led the trust her father left her with anything that belonged to the marriage. She had listened to her father's warning even as she told herself, in the private optimism of a woman in love, that she would never need to remember it. For years, she didn't. The firm grew. Dominic's name rose alongside hers on the letterhead, then eventually above it, because she had stepped back from day-to-day design work to focus on the business side, the financing, the relationships, the invisible architecture that let visible architecture exist at all. She was proud of what they built together, proud in the specific way of someone who has watched a person she believed in become exactly as capable as she always suspected he could be. She rarely reminded him where the foundation under his success had actually come from. She didn't think she needed to. She thought a marriage was a place where credit didn't need to be kept, where two people simply understood what the other had given. The way you understand the way to beam is carrying without needing to see the calculation written out every day. Celine's closest friend from those early years, a structural engineer named Marin Osei who had known her since graduate school, would later say she saw the shift in Dominic long before Celine was willing to name it out loud. Marin remembered dinners where Dominic spent half the meal on his phone, quietly answering client emails while Celine talked, and she remembered the particular way Celine would soften the moment, laughing it off, saying he was just under pressure this quarter, the way people do when they have decided in advance that naming a pattern would cost them more than tolerating it. Marin never pushed. She understood, the way old friends understand without needing it explained, that Celine had built her entire adult life around believing in people quietly and completely, and that asking her to doubt Dominic out loud would have felt, to Celine, like doubting her own judgment on every bet she'd ever placed on someone. So Marin watched and waited and kept her worry mostly to herself, the way you keep a level in your bag on a job site even when nobody has asked you to check whether the wall is actually straight. The accident happened on a Tuesday in early spring, on the interstate connecting the Ivy District to the site of a museum expansion Celine had gone to inspect personally, the kind of hands-on visit she still insisted on making even after she'd stopped drafting for a living. A truck hauling steel coils jackknife it in wet conditions 2 lanes over, and the physics of it, the kind she had spent a career understanding in buildings and never once in cars, folded the driver's side of her sedan in a way that took the use of her right leg entirely and most of the sensation in her left. She remembered very little of the impact itself, a flash of white, the smell of scorched rubber, the strange calm of shock arriving before the pain did. She remembered everything after with unbearable clarity. The surgeries, the rehabilitation center with its relentlessly cheerful staff, the moment a doctor named Alvaro Finn explained gently that the nerve damage might improve with time, or might not, and that no one on his team could promise her which. Dominic was there for the first 3 months in a way she would later give him credit for, even in her worst moments. He sat by her hospital bed with his tie loosened and his jaw tight, holding her hand like a man holding a railing in a storm he hadn't expected to be caught in. He learned to help her transfer from bed to wheelchair before the physical therapist had finished teaching him, out of a stubbornness she recognized from the boardroom, the same refusal to be bad at something in front of people. For those 3 months, she thought perhaps the accident had only revealed a deeper version of the man she married, someone willing to be inconvenienced by love. She held on to that belief even as the visits began to shorten, even as his phone became a permanent extension of his hand at her bedside, even as the words he chose started sounding, in isolation, almost reasonable. We should talk about long-term care options. Maybe it's time to think about what's realistic. Small sentences that, taken together, formed a current pulling them apart 1 inch at a time, so slowly that she nearly convinced herself she was imagining the drift. There was a night in month 7 that Celine would return to often in the months after the divorce filing. Not because it was the worst night, but because it was the clearest one. The one where the pattern finally showed its whole shape at once instead of in fragments she could still talk herself out of. Reyes and Marchetti was hosting a client reception in the warehouse lobby, the kind of event Dominic loved, string lights strung between exposed beams, a photographer capturing the space at its most flattering angle. Celine had insisted on attending, had spent 40 minutes that afternoon working out, with Julian's patient help, exactly how she would manage the transfer from her car to her chair to the reception floor without needing anyone to notice the effort it cost her. Dominic met her at the door, kissed her cheek for the benefit of arriving guests, and then, for the better part of 2 hours, simply orbited her at a careful distance, introducing her when it was unavoidable, drifting back toward his clients the moment the introduction was finished. She watched him work the room the way he used to watch job sites in his 20s, hungry, alive, fully present, and she understood, watching him be fully present for everyone in that room except her, Exactly how much of that hunger had once been directed at earning her belief, and now had nowhere left to go but outward, toward people who could still be impressed by him. She left the reception early that night, alone, and told him the next morning she'd simply gotten tired. He didn't ask a single follow-up question, and some part of her recognized, even then, that his silence was its own kind of answer. By month 9, he had stopped saying her name the moment he walked through the door, an old habit from their courtship when he used to call out Celine before he'd even crossed the threshold, wanting to hear her answer before he saw her face. She noticed its absence the way you notice a sound that has always been in a house suddenly gone quiet, not immediately, but all at once, retroactively, once you finally think to listen for it. She said nothing about it. She had learned, over those 9 months, to keep her face still while everything beneath it rearranged itself, a skill she suspected she would spend the rest of her life on learning, whatever happened next. So when he sat across from her that evening in the study, folder in hand, wedding ring already missing, and called her a liability, she was not entirely surprised. She was, however, finished pretending she hadn't heard the word land. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Dominic continued, sliding the folder toward her like a man closing a deal rather than ending a marriage. "I want this handled cleanly. You'll be taken care of financially. I'm not trying to leave you with nothing, Celine, whatever you end up thinking of me." She didn't open the folder. She had drafted worse documents than whatever sat inside it, back when she still ran a firm instead of running rehabilitation exercises in a converted sunroom every morning before he woke up. "How generous of you," she said, and her voice held steady even as something underneath it did not. "Don't make this ugly," he said, already halfway to the door in his mind. "It doesn't have to be ugly." She almost laughed. Ugly had arrived the moment he said the word liability. Everything after that was simply paperwork catching up to a decision he'd made months ago and never told her about. "You should go," she said finally. "I have calls to make." He left without asking what calls, which would matter more than he knew, and she heard the front door close behind him gentler than she expected, some old habit of consideration that hadn't entirely deserted him even now. Then his car pulled out of the driveway with the particular impatience she'd once found endearing and now simply found familiar, and the house went quiet except for the rain against the sunroom glass, steady, indifferent, the same rain that had been falling the day she married him and the day the truck crossed 2 lanes into her life. She sat alone with the folder for a long time before she finally opened it, and when she did, she found exactly what she expected, a standard separation proposal, careful language about her being provided for, no mention anywhere of Reyes and Marchetti architecture, no mention of the Ivy District warehouse, no mention of Bellwood Assets Group at all, because Dominic Reyes did not know that name existed. In 11 years, he had never once asked her a question about the firm's financing that wasn't really a question about himself, about his own advancement, his own credit line, his own name on the door. He had signed where his lawyer told him to sign and moved on to more interesting things, choosing the reception desk, selecting the artwork for the lobby, giving interviews about the vision behind a building whose ground he did not, in any legal sense, actually own. 3 weeks later, Celine sat in the office of her attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Anand who had drawn up the Bellwood Assets Group documents nearly a decade earlier and understood exactly what they meant. The office smelled of leather and old paper, the particular smell of a room where truths were kept safe rather than hidden. "He filed 2 weeks ago," Celine said, sliding the divorce paperwork across the desk. "Irreconcilable differences. Predictably vague." Priya scanned the documents with the thoroughness of someone who had watched 100 marriages end and knew that speed rarely served anyone well. "Does he know about the warehouse financing?" she asked. "He knows the building exists," Celine said. "He's never once asked what's underneath it." Priya set the papers down and folded her hands. "Then I imagine the next few months are going to be interesting for him in ways he isn't prepared for." What followed was not, Celine would insist to herself many times over the coming weeks, an act of revenge. It was simply the ordinary, unglamorous work of an attorney reviewing every entangled asset the moment a marriage entered dissolution, checking every guarantee, every place where the crumbling architecture of a relationship touched the load-bearing walls of a business. Priya's review turned up what Celine already knew but had never needed to think about day to day. The Ivy District lease ran through Bellwood Assets Group on terms Dominic's own real estate attorney had once called remarkably favorable: a below-market rate, a 10-year term, an option to buy written entirely in his favor. All of it negotiated years earlier by a wife who wanted to give her husband a foundation and never imagined she would one day need to remember whose name the deed actually carried. It took Priya's team nearly 2 weeks to trace every thread, because Celine had structured Bellwood deliberately, years earlier, to be almost invisible in the daily life of the marriage. There was the warehouse itself, held entirely under Bellwood. There was a smaller commercial unit 2 blocks away, rented to a boutique engineering firm, its income quietly reinvested into the same holding company since before Celine and Dominic had even married. There was a minority stake in a materials supplier Celine's father had once done business with, a stake Dominic had never once heard mentioned in 11 years, despite ordering steel and glass from that exact supplier for half the projects his firm had built its reputation on. Priya laid all of it out across her conference table one afternoon, page after page, and Celine sat with it in a silence that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, but something adjacent to both, the particular stillness of watching a life's quiet architecture finally revealed in full daylight to someone who had spent years assuming it didn't exist at all. More importantly, Priya's review turned up the credit line. 3 years earlier, when Dominic wanted to expand the firm onto the warehouse's second floor, add the glass-walled conference room he loved showing off to prospective clients. He had gone to the bank for financing his firm's track record alone couldn't fully support. Celine had quietly agreed to collateralize the loan using Bellwood assets, an act of belief in him she never made him feel the weight of, structured through paperwork that included a standard clause his own attorney had described as boilerplate. Any material change in the personal or marital status of a named principal would trigger a mandatory review of the collateral agreement. Dominic had signed it without reading past the summary. He had never asked what a material change might one day mean, because in 3 years of prosperity, it had never once occurred to him that the ground under his success could move. The letter went out from Bellwood Assets Group on a Tuesday morning, certified, formal, entirely within the bounds of what the original agreement allowed. Dominic's office manager, a sharp young woman named Priscilla Odom, knocked on his door holding it with a look he didn't like. "There's a certified letter," she said. "From Bellwood Assets Group. Might be a routine rent adjustment. Open it," he told her, already reaching for his phone. "I think you should open this one yourself, Mr. Reyes," she said, and something in her voice made him actually look up. He read the letter twice before the words fully assembled themselves into meaning. Bellwood was declining to renew the lease at the end of its current term, now 11 months away, invoking the no-cause clause his own lawyer had glossed over years earlier. There was also formal notice that the firm's expansion credit line, collateralized in part against Bellwood assets, was now subject to mandatory review following a material change in the personal status of a named beneficiary of the underlying trust. He read the phrase "named beneficiary" 3 times before it clicked into place, cold and sudden, like a door slamming somewhere down a long hallway he hadn't known was in his own house. "Get me Marcus," he said, and his real estate attorney, Marcus Feld, arrived within the hour, looking apologetic in the particular way of men who had missed something obvious years ago and only just realized it. Marcus spread the documents across Dominic's own reclaimed oak conference table, the one Dominic had chosen for how expensive its simplicity looked in photographs. Bellwood Assets Group is a private holding entity controlled entirely by Celine, Marcus said. "It predates your marriage. It was never community property, Dominic. It was never coming led with anything. Her signature secured this credit line voluntarily, 8 years ago, back when neither of you had any reason to think it would ever come up again." "Why would she do that?" Dominic asked, though even as he said it, some old memory was surfacing. Celine 6 years into their marriage, sitting across from him with a stack of papers, saying, "I want to help you grow this, Dominic, but I need you to understand what it means if things ever go wrong between us." He remembered brushing past the warning the way he'd brushed past so much of what she said in those years, already thinking about the next client call, already halfway out the door in his mind before she'd finished the sentence. "Because she believed in you," Marcus said simply. "And because apparently she's not the kind of person who believes in someone without protecting herself in the process." Dominic sat back heavily in his own chair, and through the window behind him the city he'd spent a career photographing and reshaping carried on, entirely indifferent to the fact that the floor beneath his firm belonged, in every legal sense that mattered, to the woman he had called a liability 3 weeks earlier in a house that also, he was only now beginning to understand, still carried her name on its deed. "Fix this," Dominic said. "I can try to negotiate the terms," Marcus said carefully, "but I need you to understand the position you're actually in. If she declines to renew the collateral agreement, the bank can call the loan in full. If she declines to renew the lease, you have 11 months to relocate an entire firm, and every landlord in this market is going to ask why your last one let you go without a fight. This isn't a negotiation, you're entering from strength." "She wouldn't do this to me," Dominic said, and Marcus looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man deciding how much honesty a client could actually bear to hear. "With respect," Marcus finally said, "you filed the divorce, Dominic. Not her. You called the meeting that ended this marriage. She's simply the one who happened to be holding the paperwork when it started to matter." Dominic spent that night alone in the warehouse long after Priscilla and the rest of the staff had gone home, walking the second floor he'd fought so hard to add, running his hand along the glass wall of the conference room he'd once described in a magazine interview as the room where the firm finally became real. He thought about the 28-year-old who had hired him out of a rented office above a dry cleaner, who had never once, in 13 years, made him feel the size of the debt he owed her, and he understood, standing alone in a room she had quietly financed without ever asking for credit, that the debt had been there the entire time, patient and unspoken, the way a foundation simply waits under a building. The meeting took place in Priya's office on a gray Thursday, 6 weeks after the divorce filing, for weeks after the letter from Bellwood Assets Group had landed on Dominic's conference table and quietly rearranged the terms of his entire future. He arrived alone, without Marcus, without his usual armor of assistants and folders, in a suit that fit slightly looser than it had 2 months earlier, the particular thinness of a man who had stopped sleeping well. Priya wheeled a chair out from behind her desk so Celine could sit comfortably at the round table rather than across a formal divide, a small gesture Celine appreciated more than she said aloud. "I asked for this meeting," Dominic said before anyone else could speak. "So I should probably start." "Go ahead," Celine said. He looked at his hands for a moment, an old habit from before he could afford a tailor, back when he used to rehearse client pitches in their kitchen, pacing, terrified of not being taken seriously by people who had never once had reason to doubt him. "I've spent the last month trying to fix the business problem," he said. "New landlord, new financing, buying out the collateral somehow." Marcus ran numbers for weeks. And somewhere in the middle of all that, it occurred to me I hadn't spent 5 minutes trying to fix the actual problem, which is me, and what I said to you in that study, like you were a line item I decided to write off. He exhaled slowly. "I've been telling myself a story for over a year, Celine. That I was overwhelmed. That I never signed up for this. That taking care of you was erasing the life I thought we were building together. There's some truth in that. I won't stand here and pretend there wasn't real fear in it. But somewhere along the way the fear turned into something uglier, and I let the resentment write the ending instead of dealing with it like a grown man." She had waited a long time to hear something like honesty from him, and now that it had finally arrived, she found she wanted to sit inside the silence a moment longer before she let him fill it. "I didn't know about Bellwood," Dominic continued. "I want to say that plainly, because I know how this looks, like I'm only sorry now that there are consequences attached, and maybe there's truth in that too. I can't promise you my remorse is uncomplicated. But finding out what you built, what you protected quietly for 8 years without ever once holding it over me, it didn't make me angry at you. It made me ashamed of myself. You had every reason to walk into this room today and let the firm collapse around me. You didn't have to give me this conversation at all. I'm not doing this out of grace," Celine said finally, her voice even. "I want to be clear about that, Dominic, because I think some part of you would like to believe this is turning into a redemption story. It might be, for you eventually. But I need you to understand something first. When you called me a liability," she continued, "you weren't describing me. You were describing your own fear of a life that didn't match the one you'd planned, and instead of carrying that fear yourself, you handed it to me and asked me to carry it too, on top of everything else I was already carrying. I have spent 11 months relearning how to trust a body that failed me once, without warning, through no fault of my own. I was not going to spend one more minute of my life shrinking myself to make you comfortable with your own cowardice. Dominic didn't argue. That, more than the apology, was what finally moved something loose in her chest, some tension she hadn't fully realized she was still holding. Here is what I've decided, Celine said, and it isn't a negotiation. Priya will draft an amended agreement. The lease will renew, but on standard commercial terms, nothing favorable, nothing tied to my father's name or mine. The collateral guarantee ends today. You'll secure your own financing going forward, on your own signature, without me behind it. I think you're capable of that. I always did. That's why I hired you in the first place, before any of this ever happened between us. And the divorce proceeds is filed, Dominic said, not quite a question. It does, Celine said. I'm not interested in staying married to a man who needed a certified letter from a holding company to remember I was a person and not a problem to be managed. But I don't want the firm to fail, Dominic. Not out of lingering love, though I won't pretend that's entirely gone after 11 years. I don't want it to fail because you built something real in that warehouse, something good, and punishing you by burning it down wouldn't heal anything left in me. It would just make me smaller too, and I've spent too long already being made smaller by people who thought I wouldn't notice. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside Priya's window, the gray afternoon had begun to clear, thin bands of late light cutting through clouds that had held the whole city in shadow for most of the morning. Thank you, Dominic said quietly, and there was nothing performative left in it, nothing staged, none of the boardroom cadence she'd learned to recognize 13 years earlier in a rented office above a dry cleaner. Don't thank me, Celine said, gathering her things. Just don't do this to the next person who loves you the way I did. 7 months later, Celine sat in the sunroom of a new house, smaller, entirely her own, in a motorized chair better suited to the independence she had rebuilt one careful session at a time. The house had no chandelier Dominic had insisted on, no oak table too large for two people, none of the furniture that had once felt permanent and now simply felt like it had belonged to someone else's life. The settlement had given her more than fairness strictly required, though she'd surprised even Priya by not fighting for the maximum available to her. She had gone back to drafting in earnest, tentative sketches becoming full proposals, and a firm 2 cities over had reached out about a consulting role focused entirely on accessible design, architecture that treated bodies like hers not as an afterthought bolted onto a finished plan, but as a first principle woven into the earliest sketch. She had said yes before she'd finished reading the email twice. She thought sometimes about the wedding ring she had finally removed the week the divorce was finalized, setting it into the small wooden box her father had once used for cufflinks. It had meant safety once, and then obligation, and then, in that last conversation in the study, the exact shape of everything she stood to lose. Sitting empty in its box now, it meant something quieter, proof that she had survived a version of herself who once believed love required disappearing a little more every year to make room for someone else's comfort. Dominic's firm was still standing. She'd heard through people who still moved in both their old circles, smaller now, financed entirely on his own signature, terms that had reportedly cost him sleep and pride in equal measure, but standing. She did not know if the man in that meeting had become permanent, or if he would fold back into the version who once called her a liability the moment real fear returned to his life again. She had stopped needing to know. Marin came by most Sundays now, bringing takeout and refusing, gently but firmly, to let Celine apologize for the years she'd spent softening Dominic's absence at their dinner table. You don't owe me an accounting of when you finally saw it, Marin told her once, sitting cross-legged on the sunroom floor the way she used to in graduate school. You saw it exactly when you were ready to survive seeing it. That's not weakness. That's timing. Celine had turned that sentence over for weeks afterward. The way she used to turn over a difficult joint in a design she couldn't quite resolve, until one evening it finally sat right in her chest instead of catching there. She thought, too, about her father, gone 6 years now, and how he had never lived to see the wedding he'd quietly warned her about turn into exactly what he'd feared without ever saying so directly. She liked to think he would have recognized himself in the way she'd finally handled it, not with anger, not with a courtroom spectacle, but with the same quiet, unglamorous carefulness he'd taught her to bring to every structure she ever touched, checking the load before she trusted the beam. She understood now, all the way down, in the part of herself that no longer needed convincing, that she had never needed her legs to be steady. She had only ever needed to remember that the ground beneath her, quite literally in Dominic's case, had been hers all along, built by her own hands, protected by her own foresight, and that no one, not even a man she had loved and believed in for over a decade, could quietly claim ownership of what she had built before he ever walked through her door. If Celine's story moved something in you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments whether you've ever had to remind someone, gently or otherwise, of exactly what was yours all along, something you built quietly, something someone else assumed they were entitled to simply because you never made them feel the cost of it. This channel only grows because people like you take a moment to subscribe to psycheTalesTv, hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story, and share this one with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength is still strength, even when nobody's clapping for it. There's another story waiting for you, just as sharp, just as quiet, and I'll be back soon to tell it to you. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.